What the actual Do you like Shakespeare? Do you like magical girls? Do you like old school RPGs with more focus on gameplay than storytelling? Then you might like This Way Madness Lies? It's hard to know who the target audience for this game is. I happen to be a casual anime fan with a theater background that has experienced and performed in a handful of Shakespeare's plays. I'm also an avid RPG player of all generations and styles, so I feel like at least on a superficial level, this should be right up my alley. But even upon writing this, I'm not entirely sure what I think about This Way Madness Lies. So let's pull back the curtain to untangle this mess of conflicting feelings together. The second I started a new game, my ears were assaulted by one of the most quizzical artistic decisions I've ever heard. I don't know what it is about Shakespeare and magical girls that made the devs think, this needs a synth rock soundtrack with vocals by a discount Florence and the Machine. But that's what they went with, and I'm sorry, but said vocals are god awful. The singer's tonal quality has a sort of breathy, nasally quality and poor intonation that you normally get when someone is pretending to sing poorly.
Up and down the boulevard, and I don't know where to begin.
Even discounting the vocals, the best tracks on the OST, and I use the word best in a relative sense, not as a compliment, are filled with inoffensively bland guitar riffs and uninteresting techno beats that feel incredibly uninspired. I know the fallback response is that music is subjective and your results may vary, but it legitimately sounded bad enough to me that it detracted from my enjoyment of the game overall. Despite not enjoying the sound of the music on its own merits, my bigger problem isn't with the tracks themselves, but how unfitting they are to the subject matter. I'm not a huge fan of rap and hip-hop either, but when I play Def Jam, it works wonders in setting the mood, and I find myself getting into the music despite my usual preferences. The soundtrack of This Way Madness Lies legitimately felt like it was written for an entirely different game. It may be in poor taste to come right out the gate with a teardown of a simple aesthetic choice, but first impressions are important, and the music was the first thing I noticed. It colored my experience from the very start, and it took a while for the other elements of the game to soften my harsh initial response. And while my opinions did shift slightly in the positive direction the more I played, the music was simply the most baffling decision the game made, not the only baffling decision. For some reason, the devs decided to tell the story through a series of still shot images, playing out like a slideshow instead of letting their sprites animate. This doesn't really fit with either the anime or theater aesthetics, which leads me to believe that it was a time-saving measure, but it ends up making the whole product feel cheaper as a whole. The visuals aren't all bad. The battle scenes are a decent-looking homage to the Shining Force and Golden Sun games, though it is disappointing that all the girls are represented by slightly modified versions of the exact same battle sprite. The character portraits are detailed and have multiple facial expressions that change based on story context, and some of the background sprite work does look good, even if the assets repeat far too often to keep from getting stale. I did really like the stage curtain opening and closing animation for the scene transitions. Of course, I have to mention the magical girl transformation scenes, which look fantastic. You couldn't really call this a magical girl game without them, could you? They were cool the first couple of times I saw them, after which I was hammering every button on my controller to skip the lengthy events. Alas, there was no ability to do so. Skipping cutscenes has been a standard feature for well over a decade now, and while this is a small gripe, I feel like it's an incredibly obvious omission that the team should have implemented. Last minute change. They have in fact now added the ability to skip these transition sequences, which means they could theoretically also fix a lot of my other gripes before you get around to playing the game. Let this be a lesson for us all. Reviews based on pre-release versions of games aren't always reflective of the final product, and any incorrect information a reviewer states may only be incorrect due to later fixes. While we're on the subject of magical girls and their transformations, I must admit that I'm not intimately familiar with that particular genre of anime. In fact, I think the only one I've seen is Madoka Magica, which is a bit of a special case. I do understand the general concept. Monster of the Week action sandwiched between cozy slice of life segments. What's not to love? Well, apparently a lot if this game is an accurate representation of the genre. The main problem is, the entirety of This Way Madness Lies story feels like it came from a single offhand remark between friends. Hey, wouldn't it be funny if there were magical girls in Shakespeare plays? I get it, it's a funny image, the sort of thing that two inebriated friends would riff off of until they were clutching their sides, but it's also the sort of joke that you tend to realize wasn't that funny after all once you've sobered up the next day. In this case, I don't think it was sobering up that made the devs come to that realization though, but using up all their material too far into development to abandon the project. You know, the sunken cost fallacy. The Shakespeare elements are pervasive, but they're not meaningful. The game opens with the man himself giving an introduction, and the dungeons are indeed loosely, and I do mean loosely, themed not so much on particular Shakespeare plays, but on particular scenes from said plays. Because the girls are part of a high school theater troupe, we get scenes of them performing variations of these plays as well. Wait, Don Pedro was cut from the Much Ado About Nothing section of the game? I demand recompense. That was my role back in the day. 0 out of 10, reviews over, I quit. The developers clearly have a lot of love for Shakespeare's catalog. There are pop quizzes pertaining to the plays and little factoids spread throughout, but it doesn't really amount to anything. You aren't exploring the themes of his stories. The parts of his productions shown are so short that I feel they wouldn't really make much sense to players that don't have prior knowledge of the material, and there aren't really related themes between the main story and his works either, except for there being parallel universe versions of several of the girls, a reference to the play The Comedy of Errors that never really goes anywhere or adds anything to the narrative. They just exist, and there's no reason to question it. It feels referential for the sake of being referential. The game is undoubtedly the newest contender for the referenced overdose TV trope page. Unsurprisingly, the bulk of the game's comedy is also reliant on these vague Shakespearean connections to form its jokes. Well, it isn't so much jokes, plural, but one joke repeated ad nauseum. Isn't it funny that people have trouble understanding the way Shakespeare wrote? I can't help but notice there's a bit of comedic irony to this. 5 years from now, the comedy in This Way Madness Lies is going to feel as dated to players as Shakespearean writing feels to the general population. Even having said that, I must admit that the script had me giggling like a schoolgirl far more than I would have expected. I really liked it, which is likely as shocking to fans of this channel as it was to me, especially given how hard I've been on games like Final Fantasy V in the past for its use of comedy. What will strike someone as funny can be nearly impossible to rationalize, and it's very quick to age. All I can say for sure is that while I was watching these scenes play out, I was very much entertained. There were remarkably few jokes that had me rolling my eyes instead of joining in on the fun. I find it quite telling that the game's best moments have nothing to do with a magical girl or Shakespeare theming at all. I had the most fun just hanging out with the cast, at the skating rink or while having a slumber party. The characters aren't anything more than one-note tropes. They don't have time to be anything more in such a short game, but the friendship comes off as genuine anyway, and you get to feel like part of that group. You are the thespian after all, and they often refer to you directly, asking for your help and advice. In a couple of places, these choices actually alter the following scene, giving a slightly personalized experience, which was a nice touch. Had I more time, I would have liked to have seen the alternative scenes play out for myself. It all felt cozy and comforting, highly reminiscent of Lucky Star, which is an anime I love. I'll be shocked if the blue-haired weeaboo Miranda wasn't at least partially inspired by Konata. Wait, and she loves s'mores? S'mores are one of my favorite things in the entire world. Miranda, Before this day, I never understood those who claim to have a waifu. My time has come. The cute girls doing cute things vibe is what carried me through this experience. It's this game's saving grace, which I never would have expected going in. Really, everything related to this game's story was the reverse of what I had anticipated. I don't tend to enjoy comedy games, with rare exceptions, but this one had me chuckling a fair bit, while the theater motif, which I have a huge soft spot for, did basically nothing for me. It seems like dungeon design is a lost art in JRPGs. That, or I was the only person who ever cared about it in the first place. The ones in This Way Madness Lies barely qualify as functional. A series of overly reused art assets that make every screen look like the last one, with linear paths that only occasionally hide a treasure chest slightly off to the side. It's clear they're here merely out of necessity. You have to have something to pace out the gauntlet of enemies the game throws at you. Contrary to this, I consider myself lucky that I got to play 2 indie RPGs in a row with interesting action economies. This Way Madness Lies follows in the footsteps of one of Zeboyd's previous games, Cosmic Star Heroine. Each character is given 8 ability slots to fill, and when an ability is used, it generally becomes unusable until the player rests for a turn to recharge it. You can also equip items which are one-time use per battle, adding a little extra versatility to your repertoire. When it comes to the act of fighting itself, the game unsurprisingly has a heavy focus on elemental weaknesses, but arguably more important than those are the status effects. Poison will be your best friend for almost the entire playthrough as a means of weakening entire enemy parties at once. And having an enemy stunned or charmed for a round can be the difference between victory and defeat. But that's not all. You also have to plan these attacks around a charge meter that, when full, gives each ability a more powerful effect, whether that be a boost to damage, a different target range, or sometimes even changing the ability's effect altogether. All of these mechanics together can make combat a satisfying puzzle to solve. Deciding not just which enemies to focus on first, but the order in which to use the abilities to maximize damage had me planning my moves several turns in advance. Though it may sound like a lot to manage and keep track of at once, it actually ends up being much more intuitive while playing than I'm likely making it sound. Even on the challenging difficulty setting, which is what I played on, it never felt overwhelming. I did die a handful of times on some tougher random battles when I got careless, but an immediate retry with a modified strategy was always enough to get me through. Battles overall are great, but not perfect. In addition to the previous options, the game also gives you Unite abilities, special attacks that can only be used once per battle and are automatically assigned based upon which pairs of girls are in your party. In the beginning, these attacks are devastating, but they don't scale well for the endgame, and a few of them are just flat out useless all the way through. It doesn't help that they power up each time a round passes, making the player survive 10 rounds in a battle before they can reach their full potential by default. The manufactured goal of combat, because of its unique action economy and hard-hitting enemies, is to try and complete battles as quickly as possible so the enemies don't kill you first. The way Unite abilities are implemented seems antithetical to that goal. I'm guessing it was designed this way so that players couldn't spam their way to victory during the early game, but it ends up undermining the entire Unite system. I was also disappointed in most of the boss fights because I generally found them easier than the random encounters leading up to them. Unfortunately, it just comes down to math. A party of 5 enemies often has the potential for more damage per round than the bosses do, and having to fend off enemies with a large variety of buffs, debuffs, and attack options is a lot harder to plan around than a single boss with a predictable attack pattern. These were only small issues though, and neither ultimately hurt the overall combat experience for me. The frequency of these battles, however, did end up dragging down the experience by the time I'd reached the final chapters. This is exacerbated by the lack of story content and dungeon complexity to space it out. The problem with puzzles is once you know their solution, they aren't fun anymore. So while This Way Madness Lies' unique take on combat is interesting at first, it lost a bit of its luster each time I ended up fighting another 5 slightly different variations on the same battle, which ended up having the same basic solution. I'm guessing the ability to choose your own party and set your skills and traits in the game's latter chapters was the intended method of staving off boredom, but there are a few problems with that. The first is that humans are hardwired to take the path of least resistance. If they find one strategy that continually works, they won't have a reason to change it up. This Way Madness Lies further encourages this playstyle by having all the girls level up simultaneously, so there's no reason to switch out party members to make sure no one falls behind. On top of this, some of the abilities aren't well explained, which makes it difficult to truly strategize while setting up your party. For example, the ability Toil becomes the ability Trouble, but what does Trouble do? As far as I can see, there's no way to tell, and the descriptions in battle are even less detailed than the ones in the menu. There's a whole page dedicated to explaining what status ailments do, but no similar page to explain what buffs do, which also feels like a glaring omission. To top it all off, I also didn't care for the trait system. Traits act as modifiers for your character's battle abilities, giving bonus effects like increasing the power of an ability but limiting who it targets, or giving added buffs when they're used. It's a cool idea that could have led to a lot of fun strategic choices in character builds, except for the fact that character stat bonuses are directly tied to these traits. Each one you unlock gives substantially better stat upgrades than the previous one, so you're incentivized to always upgrade to the newest unlocked trait. It isn't the trade-off it presents itself as, it's a forced change in playstyle that you can't really do anything about if you want to remain effective in battle. This system completely ruins party experimentation and further reinforces the mindset that the player should simply stick with what works. Technically, some of the battle tedium was my own fault. This Way Madness Lies goes for the Chrono Trigger style of no random encounters, instead giving you the the opportunity to avoid them by simply running around them. This is great in theory, but not so much in practice. Maybe I'm wrong, but my experience is that most old school RPG fans, who are presumably the target demographic for this game, learned at a very young age to avoid as few battles as possible so that they wouldn't be underleveled during the endgame. That's how I tend to play my RPGs, only avoiding battles when I'm low on resources, which isn't possible here because the game fully heals your party after each battle, or when I'm backtracking. That also isn't an issue here because the game is designed in a linear fashion that makes backtracking pointless. By the time I finished the game, fighting every enemy I found but never farming extra fights by using the nifty little start battle feature in the pause menu, I ended up feeling over-leveled for the final boss. In a title as linear as this, where enemies are hand-placed obstacles, the entire party shares levels, and there are no equipment upgrades so no one can possibly fall behind, there are far fewer variables to worry about than in most games when it comes to balancing player progression. I really wish the dev team had taken advantage of that fact and put some extra time into restructuring the game so that battles were less frequent. It would have helped both make the bosses more satisfying and kept the normal combat from becoming such a chore. Would I recommend This Way Madness Lies? I still don't know, honestly. The entire game is built around its singular joke. What if Shakespearean plays had monsters and magical girls? The dev team got way more mileage out of said joke than I think anyone could have reasonably expected, and for that I commend them. On top of that, when the game is at its best, it is entertaining and strategic. Beyond that, however, the entire experience feels rushed and amateur. It's artistically dissonant with its story, visuals, and sound not blending at all. The bland dungeons and overuse of combat makes the short runtime drag, and there are several quality of life omissions that feel like a no-brainer. It is an indie game, and I don't expect perfection, but it's also the company's 7th RPG, and they've done far better than this in the past. Cosmic Star Heroine was by the same group, and I loved that one. Seriously, if you haven't played it, you should. Consider this a massive Stiles recommendation for that title. I actually booted it up to capture footage for this video and had trouble putting it back down. I would be remiss not to admit that there were several moments where I was genuinely enjoying myself while playing This Way Madness Lies, but in the moments I wasn't having fun, I was miserable, and there was no real in-between. It was either elation or disdain at all times. I'm struggling to decide if one side outweighed the other. If I gave review scores, this would be an exact 5 out of 10 because the game is a mix of terrible ideas in some places but great execution in others. It's like watching a high school play with one standout lead that you know is going to make it big someday. If I may rely once more on my background in theater to finally get my feelings across, I'd give the game a polite round of applause for its efforts, but it's far from worthy of a standing ovation. Thank you all for watching, commenting, and sharing my content if you choose to. It helps keep me motivated and always leads to more growth. If you want to see more, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you actually see my videos when they come out. I'd also like to thank Zeboyd Games for providing me with a review code for this game. I was a huge fan of Cosmic Star Heroine and jumped at the opportunity to try their next release. But most of all, I'd like to thank my generous supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar: Caffeine, Charlotte Sommers, Gabe Nunez, Green Poolball, and Nikol Hypa. For those that don't know, I've got some stretch goals planned for the channel. At 5,000 subs, I'll begin reviewing either the Persona series or the Suikoden series. At 20 active supporters through Patreon and Subscribestar, I will review either Legend of Dragoon or Lost Odyssey. And at $100 a month, I will review any duology. Something like The World Ends With You or Nier or Dark Cloud, whatever else you can come up with as long as it's exactly 2 games. That's all for this video. I've got one more indie RPG review coming soon, and then something special planned for December. So I hope to see you all there.